Okay, today we're looking at 1 Nephi chapter 3 verse 2. And it came to pass that he spake unto me, saying, Behold, I have dreamed a dream, in the which the Lord hath commanded me that thou and thy brethren shall return to Jerusalem. Let's look at one of the most Hebrew verses in all of the Book of Mormon. We've talked about in the past the term, and it came to pass. If you need to go back and learn about this, go back to chapter 1 verse 7. Go see that video. It's all about and it came to pass. The part we're going to be looking at even more so is dreamed a dream. It's called the cognitive accusative, and in Hebrew the term is halamti halom, which is a Hebrew idiom. It's a very common idiom in Hebrew. This is something that they say quite often in Hebrew, dreamed a dream. It's not good sentence structure in English, and it's not a phrase that we use commonly. So why was the phrase dreamed a dream used in the Book of Mormon if Joseph Smith was making this volume up? There's two possible answers. One is he saw it somewhere used in English and repeated it into his book. And number two possible scenario was he knew Hebrew so well that he knew the idioms and he knew the sentence structure to be able to go back and put this idiom into the narrative to be found later by someone who knew Hebrew and identified as authentically Hebrew in order to build his case. We're going to look at each of those scenarios. So the first one is he just used it as an English phrase. So here we have the cognitive accusative being used throughout the Book of Mormon. Here you can see Jacob, Mosiah. We have cursed with a sword cursing, worked all manner of work, judged with righteous judgment. So cognitive accusative, you're using the same root word as both the verb and the noun. So we cursed with a sword cursing, we worked all manner of fine work, we judged judgments, we dreamed a dream. So the same root word is used both as a verb and as a noun, not something we do in English, something obviously very common in Hebrew. So this is not common in English. In fact, so uncommon you can see these are all the instances that we have in known literature where the term was used in English, and only two of these works were printed before 1830. So we have a 14th century Denmark book that was printed in English in Denmark. So Joseph Smith would not have had access to that. Was printed prior to the publication of the Book of Mormon. And we have the first line in Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, which was written prior to the Book of Mormon, which would have been the only chance he could have ever even seen this term prior to translating the Book of Mormon. We see these other instances from Les Miserables, Aretha Franklin, Christina Aguilera, Bob Dylan. Some of these music writers have used it as a way to provide emphasis. But prior to 1830, there was very few instances of this term ever being used. The chances of him seeing this somewhere and reproducing it were very small. The only possibility would be the first line of Pilgrim's Progress, which we have no record of him ever checking out, reading, or having ownership of that book. That would have been the only time he would have ever seen that term, and he would have had to remember that term after reading it and being able to put it back into the Book of Mormon in his fictional narrative. So that's not likely scenario. The next most likely scenario would be he actually knew Hebrew, he knew the idioms, he was fluent enough that he knew the sentence structure and was familiar with the culture enough that he could use these idioms in a way that a Hebrew would use them. In order to become that fluent, that he would have had to know the sentence structure and the idioms of Arabic languages. The average American would take 2,200 hours to become that fluent and practicing it. That's with the technology that we have today. That's with the resources that we have today. The resources that they had in the 1820s for a young teen to be able to dedicate 2,200 hours to become this fluent in Hebrew, along with his regular work that he had to do each day, his regular farming, his regular social hours, his eating and sleeping. The math doesn't add up. Him being able to find 2,200 hours to be able to study this. Much less, we find that he didn't know Hebrew as late as 1835, and him and Oliver decided they should probably learn some Hebrew. This was 5 to 6 years after the publication and translation of the Book of Mormon. and they didn't know anyone that spoke Hebrew. They couldn't find anybody to teach them Hebrew, even though they wanted to learn. They ended up finding a Jew named Joshua Sextus that taught the Hebrew class in the School of the Prophets for 3 months. At the end of the 3-month course, they said Joseph was now able to read some Hebrew, but could not speak it. So we have people sitting with Joseph trying to learn this language that he supposedly already knew well enough to be able to not only read it, but write it and use sentence structure perfectly and know the idioms that took place prior to even taking this class. So that is also not likely. And again, we have the most plausible scenario is that Joseph Smith was telling the truth, that this was translated by the gift and power of God from an ancient Hebrew document.